President Trump is set to sign a bill this morning that would fund the federal government and prevent a second shutdown. But
he will also be issuing a national emergency declaration at the same time. And I've indicated to him that I'm going to support the national emergency declaration.
Republican Mitch McConnell made that announcement on the Senate floor. It is worth noting when McConnell said this, what he said, and who was saying it. The Senate was about to vote on a border security defeat for the president. Lawmakers approved the bill without billions for a border wall. McConnell said the president will claim emergency powers to spend the money that Congress denied him. It's striking that McConnell was the one to support this end run around Congress, since he is a leader in Congress, and was widely reported to have advised the president not to do this.
NPR's congressional correspondent Susan Davis is in the studio with us this morning, along with national security correspondent David Welna, who's on the line. Good morning to you both.
Good morning.
Good morning.
David, let's start with you. By declaring a national emergency, what specific authorities does that give the president?
It gives him potentially many authorities. There are hundreds of statutes that Congress has been approving since the time of George Washington that lie dormant most of the time. They are only activated when the president declares a national emergency. By law, he has to cite which specific statutes he's going to be using. But when he does use these statutes, there's really no definition that Congress has ever given for what constitutes a national emergency. So it'd be hard to challenge him on the grounds that, no, this doesn't fall within what we consider a national emergency. Congress does have ways to block a national emergency. Both chambers would have to vote to do that and then send that to the president for him to sign. And if he doesn't, they'd have to override a veto from him. So really, this sort of opens the way for him to tap those powers and try to get the money that Congress refused to give him in this bill that he's expected to sign today.
So, Sue, how's Congress reacting to this?
Well, as Steve noted, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell supports it, which came as some surprise because we do know from our own reporting that he had expressed private concerns to the White House about this course of action. Not all Republicans are on board. Republicans like Susan Collins of Maine have said publicly they do not support the president going in this path. Marco Rubio of Florida said that he believed that this could set a precedent for future presidents to use. And House Speaker Nancy Pelosi spoke to that dynamic.
I'm not advocating for any president doing an end run around Congress. I'm just saying that the Republicans should have some dismay about the door that they are opening, the threshold they are crossing.
Democrats overwhelmingly oppose it, and Pelosi is saying to Republicans like Marco Rubio, you are right to be concerned.
Because they could use a national emergency. If Democrats could take the White House back, they could declare a national emergency on climate change or gun control or any number of issues.
And she specifically mentioned gun legislation in her remarks.
So what does Congress do in this moment?
So they have options. The first option is the law that gives the power the president to do this gives Congress the power to take it away. They have the authority to pass resolutions of disapproval that would essentially block the president. The political reality is you would need a veto-proof majority in both chambers to do that, and they probably don't have that because Republicans control the Senate. They also can challenge it in the courts, and Democrats are saying they are prepared to do that. How they challenge it goes to what exactly the president does, but remember, there's a constitutional challenge at question here. The Constitution is very clear in Article 1 that Congress gets to decide how money is appropriated, and the president is challenging what that means.
But, David, where is the money going to come from? I mean, the White House has suggested that there will be all kinds of pots of money that the national emergency will give the president access to. What pots of money?
Well, it's most certainly not pots of money coming from Mexico to pay for a wall, despite all the president's earlier promises. These pots of money are all funding that Congress has already approved for other purposes, and mostly they seem to be associated with the Department of Defense, which gets about 2/3 of the money that Congress approves each year. We don't have the specifics yet from the White House, but it appears that Trump is going to try to raid other accounts to add more than $6 billion to the $1.375 billion that Congress has approved for a border barrier, for a total of $8 billion. That's a lot more than the $5.7 billion he'd been seeking. And most of that money, $3.5 billion, is expected to come from the Pentagon Amazon's military construction budget. And that's likely to anger a lot of defense hawks on both sides of the aisle because that money was all meant to be spent improving military bases. There's also about $2.5 billion in the Defense Department's drug interdiction program that Trump is expected to tap, as well as their $600 million from Treasury's drug forfeiture fund.
Wait a minute. So the president has been expressing concern about drug trafficking across the border, and he's going to take away drug trafficking interdiction money in order to build the wall. Is that correct?
That's right. And I guess he would argue that, well, this is all about stopping drugs, and that's what the military money was meant for. That's what I'm going to do with it, too.
Which is just fascinating, because if that money were available, they would have appropriated it that way in the first place, because at its core, this is all a spending debate. This is all about creating the budget, as is Congress's writ to do. And if that money had been available, they would have done it the first time.
Right. And they shortchanged the president on what he wanted, but it was saying basically Congress judges that this is as much money as you should get for this.
So there are national emergencies. I mean, it's nothing new, right? And there are dozens that are currently active. Is that right, David? What
There
are
are
these?
dozens that are active, but they're mainly actions that are freezing the assets of foreigners in U.S. banks, that kind of thing. President Trump has actually done a couple of those things. This is very unusual that a president would declare a national emergency to get money that Congress would not give him, effectively making an end run around Congress. In fact, it's hard to find any other president who's ever done this, so we're in uncharted waters right now.
Sue, any inclination as to what happens like over the next hours and days?
Well, as David said, we really are looking for where exactly the president's going to draw this money from. Remember, we knew the White House was thinking about this. So Democrats have also been prepared for this. In the response to the State of the Union, one of the responses, California Attorney General Javier Becerra, a former member of Congress, cited this national emergency threat and said if the president were to go forward on this, Democrats were prepared and he would file action in court the day the president signs the declaration. So we're looking for the specifics on it and then who in the Democratic Party are going to bring these suits.
Interesting. I remember interviewing independent Angus King of Maine when the down had just begun, and he predicted, as others did, that the only way that people could save face and keep the government open was this idea of a national emergency, and now they're going to have to deal with it. NPR's Susan Davis and David Welna, thanks so much, you guys.
You're welcome.
You're welcome.
All right, when Amazon announced they were looking for cities to house their new headquarters, it was almost like a popularity contest.
A very expensive popularity
Indeed.
contest. Cities submitted proposals about all the amazing things they could offer Amazon, and in turn, the corporation promised a lot of jobs and an economic boost. After a long, highly publicized search, New York was selected as one of two locations, along with Alexandria outside of Washington, D.C. New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio was delighted.
This was unprecedented. And Amazon had a national competition because they had something worth competing for.
But just 3 months later, that relationship has come to an end because Amazon announced yesterday that it is canceling the plans for its New York City campus.
NPR's business correspondent Alina Selyuk joins us in studio to explain why. We should also note Amazon is an NPR underwriter. Alina, good morning.
Good morning.
So Amazon made a huge deal about the search for these locations in the announcement. You'd think they would have thought through all the potential pitfalls, right? What happened in New York?
I think this really was quite the jarring development for everybody involved. I mean, we were hearing from some local groups who were meeting with Amazon officials as early as Thursday morning, and nobody in those meetings seemed to know that this was coming. The hugest sticking point in all of this for the critics was the fact that the city and the state were offering a really large subsidy package to Amazon, tax breaks of almost $3 billion.
Right.
Add to that the upset city council. This was really big. Amazon had picked an approval process that involved the mayor and the governor, but gave city council no real power over the deal. Upset city council.
Right.
And also, in a way, this was a reflection of the rise of the progressive left. Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had been an outspoken critic, and her district is near the area where Amazon wanted to build the new HQ. And there's something to be said about New York groups really knowing how to mobilize. In this case, housing groups, union groups, all kinds of groups came together at those city council hearings where Amazon was just pummeled. And the supporters had their arguments too. A potential of 25,000 well-paying jobs is nothing to sneeze at. Plus, in the area of Queens that doesn't really have a tech presence. But supporters weren't as visible as the activists. And really, in New York, this played out more like a political fight than a business negotiation.
So can I ask about the argument of AOC? It was just, we don't think Amazon's going to give enough back to our local community. It's not worth it, the tax breaks, basically?
Yes.
So what are we hearing from inside Amazon at this point about what it means for their headquarters expansions worldwide?
Right. So they're saying they can't really do a project in a place where local elected officials don't want to work with them, and they will not be looking for a replacement location, although certainly other cities are probably calling them now. We saw Chicago officials publicly saying they'd welcome a reconsideration from Amazon. And even back in New York, while Amazon critics celebrated last night, many people were torn about how this played out. Maybe they didn't love the financials of the deal, but they didn't want Amazon to just walk away. We spoke to Chris Hanway, executive director of a Queens-based nonprofit, Jacob A. Riis Neighborhood Settlement, and he said he'd kept his mind open about the HQ deal and was sad about the lost job opportunities for Queens residents. But he also said Amazon hasn't been fully forthcoming with answers to some of the questions the local groups had.
I think this is a real lesson for everybody who, whether you're on the organizing side or you're on the corporate side, about the importance of communication.
Communication. So, Alina, just briefly, this is a model for economic development. A lot of cities lure in businesses with tax breaks. Is this going to change anything to that model?
It's hard to say. The system that was run on tax incentives has existed for a long time, but because this will go down in history as such a high-profile failure to strike an agreement, I'm sure that the activists who oppose taxpayer-funded incentives will forever use this as fodder for the broad campaign against these kind of mega deals.
Right. NPR's Alina Selyuk for us this morning. Alina, thank you.
Thank you.
President Trump declared a national emergency. Then he headed to Florida to spend the weekend at his Mar-a-Lago resort.
Others spend their weekend preparing to contest the president's actions in court. Many are focused on the president's own words, like California's Attorney General Javier Becerra.
He himself said it. He did not need to announce or declare a crisis. He did not have to call this an emergency. He has also said he knows he's going to lose in court.
On Fox News Sunday, White House advisor Stephen Miller tried to clarify the president's words.
What the president was saying is that like past presidents, he could choose to ignore this crisis, but that's not what he's going to do.
All right, let's bring in NPR White House correspondent Scott Horsley. Good morning, Scott.
Good morning, David. Happy President's Day.
Well, happy President's Day to you as well. And let's talk about the presidency. Talk to me about who is suing President Trump here.
The state of California is one. They are going to be joined by a number of other states, including New Mexico, Oregon, Minnesota, Hawaii. Separately, we're seeing litigation from the ACLU and from 3 Texas landowners who, along with an environmental group, Frontera Audubon Society, feel like their lands could either be taken or otherwise compromised by the president's wall. Now, as the California Attorney General said, the president did acknowledge the threat of this litigation when he announced the emergency on Friday, and he did say he expects to lose in the early rounds, but he also said he expects to prevail ultimately. That's, of course, what happened with the travel ban last year.
He's trying to set the expectations for what he assumes could be a big legal battle ahead. So talk to me about exactly his authority. I mean, the National Emergencies Act does give the White House and the president really broad authority to declare emergencies like this. So what exactly are these challenges based on?
Javier Becerra says there are 8 billion ways that the president's emergency order could harm his state of California. He's referring there, of course, to the $8 billion that the White House is eyeing for wall construction. About $1.4 billion of that was actually authorized by Congress, so that's not really in dispute. What's at issue here is the other $6.6 billion that the administration now wants to divert from the Treasury and the Defense Department to build about 4 times as much wall as lawmakers actually authorized. Opponents say that amounts to usurping Congress's power to control the government's purse strings. Now, as you say, the Emergency Act does give the president broad discretion, and the White House is really painting this as just a routine use of executive discretion to move money around. In fact, they say the president could have redirected some of these funds without even announcing a national emergency.
So beyond these legal challenges, I mean, you have activists and many lawmakers, including some Republicans, complaining about this loudly. But beyond lawsuits, is there much that anyone can do if they won't stop this?
Well, the National Emergencies Act does give Congress an opportunity to challenge the president through political means, and we certainly expect to see that in the House, the Democratic House, and possibly in the Senate, where there was some concern among Republican senators as well. Ultimately, though, probably won't be enough to overcome a presidential veto there. So we're also seeing congressional investigations, and as you mentioned, a lot of political demonstrations around the country on this President's Day.
All right, NPR White House correspondent Scott Horsley. Thanks, Scott.
You're welcome.
All right, Andrew McCabe was the deputy director of the FBI until he was fired by then Attorney General Jeff Sessions last year.
Yeah, McCabe has just released a memoir. It is titled The Threat, and he's been speaking out about the Trump administration's decision to push him out.
Firing me 26 hours before my retirement sends an unbelievably chilling message to the rest of the men and women of the FBI.
McCabe played a pivotal role in investigating Russia's alleged involvement in the 2016 election. He says he thinks he was fired because he opened 2 investigations into President Trump himself.
All right, an NPR team interviewed McCabe. That team included NPR Justice correspondent Carrie Johnson, who's with us. Hi there, Carrie.
Good morning, David.
So much to ask you about here. I guess, can you start by talking about McCabe and how he has been summarizing the relationship between the president, people around the president, and the Russian government?
Andy McCabe confirmed that he opened 2 investigations of President Trump himself, a counterintelligence investigation and a criminal obstruction of justice investigation after Trump fired his boss, Jim Comey, in 2017. McCabe said there was a good reason to investigate. Take a listen to what he had to say.
I don't know that we have ever seen in all of history an example of the volume and the significance of the contacts between people in and around the president and his campaign with our most serious, our existential international enemy, the government of Russia.
Now, David, we pressed Andy McCabe about whether he thought there was conspiracy or collusion between anybody in Trump's orbit and Russia. He wouldn't go that far, but he said the evidence uncovered by the special counsel to date has been extremely persuasive.
And so the other one other interesting thing we're learning about with McCabe is he is someone who would brief the president on national security, sometimes relating to Russia, right? I mean, did he talk about those meetings with Donald Trump?
There was one very jarring experience that McCabe shared in 2017 where someone else at the FBI went to the White House to try to brief the president about how Russia was using some buildings here inside the U.S. that have since been closed to collect intelligence, not just for recreational purposes. And McCabe recounts that instead of wanting to talk about Russia, the president turned the conversation to North Korea and North Korean missiles and basically told this FBI briefer that he did not believe the U.S. intelligence assessment. Rather, he believed Vladimir Putin, the leader of Russia, who denied anything with North Korea had taken place. And here is how McCabe described his takeaway.
How do we impart wisdom and knowledge and the best of our intelligence assessments to someone who chooses to believe our adversaries over our intelligence professionals?
That's just one of the frustrating experiences he described in the book.
But we should say, Carrie, McCabe has been criticized himself. I mean, by the Inspector General, criticizing him for his disclosures to reporters. I mean, did he defend himself in terms of some of that stuff?
Remember, the Inspector General at the Justice Department concluded that McCabe lacked candor when he was interviewed under oath multiple times by investigators at the FBI and the Justice Department. The central issue here is whether he authorized people on his FBI staff to leak information to the Wall Street Journal in 2016. McCabe is now the source of or the subject of an inquiry by the U.S. Attorney's Office in D.C., an ongoing criminal inquiry.
All right, NPR's Carrie Johnson interviewed McCabe along with Steve Inskeep, and their interview, you can find longer portions of it by going to npr.org and also by listening to the program this morning. Carrie Johnson, thanks so much. We appreciate it.
My pleasure.
All right, the investigation into an alleged attack on the actor Jussie Smollett has taken another turn.
Yeah, police had arrested 2 brothers who they considered potential suspects in this case, but these men have now been released. A police spokesperson confirmed that the information that these men offered has now shifted the whole inquiry, and police now want to speak with Smollett again. The actor is best known for his role on the TV drama Empire, and he told police last month that he was attacked by two men in ski masks who made racist and homophobic slurs at him while putting a rope around his neck.
All right, Miles Bryan reports for NPR affiliate WBEZ in Chicago and joins us this morning. Hi there, Miles.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for coming on. What a case to follow. I mean, the allegations here of such a vicious attack. How has this case been evolving since the initial reports of this?
Right. I mean, it's been taking turns almost every day at this point.
Yeah.
In the last few days, the Chicago police had been seeking two persons of interest that were caught on video. Midweek last week, they picked up two brothers returning to Chicago from Nigeria. And arrested them and questioned them for about 2 days. And then on late Friday night, they actually released the brothers, saying they were no longer suspects. And at that point, they said the information that had come out of that questioning had led the investigation to take a new turn. And most recently, they're now seeking to re-interview Mr. Smollett again. But they haven't been very explicit what turn that the investigation has actually taken. They're just looking into something new.
Okay, so we don't know much about what turn this might be taking, but what do we know at this point about these two brothers and why they might have provided information that has led investigators to make a change here?
Right. The police say that one has worked on the show Empire. And in a Saturday night statement, Mr. Smollett's attorneys acknowledged that Smollett knew one of the brothers and that one of the brothers actually trained him for a music video, helped him prepare for a music video. Now, in that statement, Smollett stood by his statement that he was the victim of a hate crime, but they did respond to some reports alleging that the two brothers told investigators, or the two brothers maybe offered up some information about how the attack was staged, and Mr. Smollett pushed back on that and said that was ridiculous and wrong.
Okay, so I mean, this obviously we don't know much. Nothing. We have not confirmed anything, but this suggestion out there that this might have somehow been staged, elevated enough that Smollett's own attorneys are actually responding to it, which is interesting.
Yeah, exactly. It is interesting that they responded to that, but they also made it clear that they were responding to reports. And they did not want to deal with sources being cited in the news media, and they wanted to continue to cooperate with police, and we're looking forward to an official update on the investigation.
So what happens now? The police say they're going to talk to Jussie Smollett again, and then I guess we see where the case takes us from there, and what more twists and turns we see.
It's changing every couple of hours, but that's what's next, is they're hoping to sit down with Mr. Smollett.
All right, WBEZ reporter Miles Bryan covering this case that keeps taking more twists and turns. Jussie Smollett alleging that he was the subject of an attack in Chicago. Miles, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
President Trump is starting his 2020 campaign with a push to change the president in a different country.
That's right. He was holding a rally in Miami yesterday. The crowd there was mostly Venezuelan and Cuban immigrants, and President Trump repeated his call for Venezuela's President Nicolas Maduro to go.
Maduro is not a Venezuelan patriot. He is a Cuban puppet.
The president reiterated U.S. support for opposition leader Juan Guaido, and he called on the Venezuelan military to abandon Maduro or risk losing everything.
We've got NPR White House correspondent Scott Horsley with us this morning. Hey, Scott.
Good morning, Rachel.
What are the politics behind this speech? I mean, who was the president's intended audience?
Well, this was partly aimed at the military and other parts of the Venezuelan government who've been propping up Maduro. Some 50 other countries have now joined the U.S. in supporting the National Assembly President Juan Guaido as the legitimate leader of Venezuela.
Right.
And Trump is calling on those who are supporting Maduro in Venezuela to do the same.
The eyes of the entire world are upon you today, every day, and every day in the future. You cannot hide from the choice that now confronts you.
But Rachel, this speech was also directed at the audience of Venezuelan expats right there in South Florida, a group that is overwhelmingly opposed to the Maduro government, and by the way, a group that could be a big source of support for the president in a 2020 swing state.
Right, Florida, kind of important. So that's the politics. What about the policy? I mean, what is the next move for the Trump administration when it comes to Venezuela?
The president didn't telegraph his next move, although the White House always says all options are on the table. Of course, the big move that the Trump administration has taken is to impose economic sanctions on Venezuela's national oil company, starving Maduro of an important source of revenue. The U.S. is also trying to deliver humanitarian assistance to the Venezuelan people, although so far that aid has been mostly stopped at the Colombian border. But as we say, this speech was really more of a raucous political rally than a sober foreign policy address where a lot of new policies were rolled out.
Right. And you can't really have a political rally right now in February of 2019 without projecting towards the 2020 election, can you? And the president took that opportunity.
Just as he did in his State of the Union address, the president combined his attack on corrupt socialist government in Venezuela with left-leaning policies put forward by some Democrats here at home. He declared that socialism is dying across the Western Hemisphere, and he repeated his vow that America will never be a socialist country.
The implication, of course, being there that the Democrats would put forth some kind of socialist agenda that his base and perhaps others would not be palatable in the 2020 election. Scott Horsley, thank you for your time as always.
You're very welcome, Rachel.
Okay, it has been months since the midterm elections. A new Congress has been sworn in, but one House seat remains in dispute.
It sure does. That seat is in North Carolina's 9th congressional district. Republican Mark Harris leads Democrat Dan McCready in an unofficial tally, but no result has been declared because of these allegations of fraud and misconduct.
We believe the evidence will show that a coordinated, unlawful, and substantially resourced absentee ballot scheme operated during the 2018 general election.
That's the voice of Kim Strock. She's the executive director of North Carolina's State Elections Board. That was at a hearing yesterday where investigators are detailing what they have learned, and that hearing is going to go on today.
NPR's Miles Parks has been covering this story from the beginning and joins us now. Hey, Miles.
Good morning.
So, unlawful, coordinated scheme? Can you just remind us about the scope of these charges? What are we talking about?
Right. So the investigation is centered on a man named McCrae Dowless, who is working as a political contractor for Republican Mark Harris's campaign. Dowless is alleged to have been paying people to register voters as well as paying people to pick up ballots, which is illegal in North Carolina. What's still unclear is whether Dowless turned in all the ballots he and his team collected, or whether they were manipulated or thrown away or anything like that. The numbers in the county where Dowless worked were really tilted toward Harris in a way that made the state board, as well as election watchers nationally, really suspicious.
So these hearings are happening, right? Who testified and what was communicated during the hearing?
Right. So day one was taken up mostly by Dowless's former stepdaughter. Her name is Lisa Britt, and she said Dowless paid her to pick up people's ballots. She also said she even filled out some down ballot races for people who left them blank, basically as a means to get rid of a red flag for the State Board of Elections. The most dramatic moments of the day came when Britt was talking about how Dowless actually tried to interfere in the State Board's investigation. Britt said Dowless reached out to her multiple times, and he even tried to tell her exactly what to say at Monday's hearing.
So what is Dowless himself saying?
Nothing at this point. He was actually called to testify at the end of the day yesterday, but that didn't end up happening. Basically, he wasn't compelled legally to testify because under state law, for the board to do that, they would have had to also grant him immunity from being prosecuted for that testimony at a later date. Here's board chair Robert Cordell.
And this board is unwilling to give a witness here, and particularly Mr. Dowless, immunity from his testimony.
Dowless's attorney, Cynthia Singletary, told reporters after the hearing Dowless would, quote, love to testify under the right circumstances, but she did not elaborate on what those right circumstances would have to be.
But clearly there's still some legal jeopardy ahead, perhaps, for him. Is the end game a new election? I mean, what happens with this seat?
That's definitely one possibility. The board is made up of 3 Democrats and 2 Republicans, and they need to come to some sort of bipartisan agreement at the end of this hearing to either hold a new election or to certify Harris. If they don't, then Harris does technically get certified no matter what, but that certification goes to the U.S. House to approve it or deem the seat vacant. A lot of this just depends on what is the exact amount of fraud or manipulation that deems an entire election in an entire congressional district moot. We know that Dallas and his team filled out more than 1,000 registration forms, but we still don't know how many ballots were actually affected by them and how close that actually was to Harris's 900-vote lead. We may never know exactly how many ballots Dallas and his team affected.
What about broader implications of this case?
Well, we know that Democrats in the House have decided to make election security a big priority now that they control the chamber. So you can definitely see the writing on the wall. If this does end up being deadlocked at the state level and get to the national level, that Democrats in the House can make this a sort of rallying cry. We saw that in Georgia and we saw that in Florida in the midterms as well with election administration. People I've talked to in the elections world have also been really interested in the fact that President Trump hasn't weighed in yet.
Right, because he has done so on this issue before when it was to his advantage, even though those claims were unsubstantiated. NPR's Miles Parks, thanks.
Thank you.
All right, we're going to turn now to Syria and the last stand of ISIS in the region.
Yeah, in a pretty tense situation. So here it is. You have U.S. forces in Syria. They are holding hundreds of ISIS fighters who travel to Syria from Europe. The Trump administration is getting ready to pull its troops out of the country. And as part of that, they want European countries to take responsibility for those prisoners by accepting them back to their home countries.
NPR's Ruth Sherlock has been following this closely and joins us now from Beirut. Hey, Ruth.
Hello.
So we're talking about 800 prisoners that the U.S. is holding that have kind of a European connection, are from Europe. What are European nations saying? Are they going to take these prisoners back?
Well, I mean, first of all, the problem is actually much bigger than just the 800 prisoners. There's also about 2,000 women and children from some 46 countries that the Kurds are holding. So, you've also got a lot of civilians. Over 1,000 of these people are children.
Wow.
But taking these people back is very politically unpalatable for many European countries. So Britain has stripped some of these people of their nationality. Belgium and France apparently tried to strike a deal whereby they'd take back the children, but not the women, and certainly not the male prisoners. President Trump is now urging them to take these people back, but so far France has responded by sort of ignoring that request, saying, no, we're going to deal with them on a case-by-case basis. The Kurds that are holding them, by the same token, are also afraid to just release these people because, should there ever be a terror attack in Europe in the future and should it ever be traced back to any of these people, that would be very dangerous for them too. They would get blamed.
Meanwhile, the fight against ISIS continues, even though President Trump keeps insisting that their defeat is near. How much territory does ISIS actually still hold in Syria?
Well, it comes down to a few hundred square meters, and it's really just a hamlet of tents now. You can actually look through binoculars and see people moving around. They can't take this area, though, because there are lots of civilians. Locals, fighters that I've spoken to estimate there's over 1,000 civilians. That's US-backed fighters. Most of these are hostages that ISIS have taken or families of ISIS fighters. So negotiations are underway to try to find a solution to this. I should say that, though, the territory that ISIS controls is about to be taken back. ISIS remains a threat, according to US officials. The group itself is not defeated.
Right. And of course, all this is affecting countless civilians. And you have been to Syria. You have heard some of these stories. Can you just give us a sense of what life is like right now?
It's terrible. The conditions in Al-Hul camp that we went to, the main camp for where people from this area have been fleeing, are awful. People can't even get tents in some situations. The International Rescue Committee says that more than 60 people have died trying to leave this area and get it, or once they arrive in the camp. And overall, entire swathes of northeastern Syria and a whole city of Raqqa has been decimated in the fight against ISIS. So civilians are suffering desperately. Many thousands have died, and many don't have their home. They don't have homes to go to any longer.
NPR's Ruth Sherlock for us this morning. Ruth, thank you so much. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
During the past 2 years of attention-grabbing news stories in Washington, another news story has rumbled just below the surface.
That's right. Saudi Arabia has been seeking nuclear technology from the United States. The Saudis want nuclear power plants as they reshape their economy. They do not necessarily want to sign on to the usual limits for how that technology might be used. And the House Oversight Committee now reveals some of the Saudis' American advocates. One-time National Security Advisor Michael Flynn pushed this plan despite the objections of White House lawyers. Other Trump administration officials took up the cause long after Flynn was fired.
NPR's Tim Mack covers national security, and he's in our studios. Tim, good morning.
Good morning.
So what were the concerns specifically about the Saudis asking the United States to sell them nuclear technology?
Well, there are a couple concerns raised in this new investigative document from the House Oversight Committee. Well, firstly, the law requires that Congress approve any transfer of nuclear technology to a foreign country. But the committee's report states that a senior director at the National Security Council reportedly ignored warnings and insisted that a decision to transfer nuclear technology to Saudi Arabia had already been made.
Oh, so go ahead with the sale even though Congress has not said yes or no.
Yeah, and not only that, there were concerns about possible conflicts of interest, that Michael Flynn had one possible conflict of interest that could violate the law, possibly, and that according to Trump administration whistleblowers, NSC staff, National Security Council staff, were told to stop working on the nuclear technology transfer plan because of this concern.
What would the conflict of interest be for Michael Flynn?
So for about 7 months in 2016, including during the presidential transition itself, Flynn served as an advisor to IP3 International. That's a private company seeking to build nuclear plants in Saudi Arabia. The whistleblowers told the House Oversight Committee that Flynn continued to advocate for their plan even after he joined the White House as the president's national security advisor in 2017.
Okay, so there's the classic kind of revolving door problem of someone who had a job in private industry, they're advocating for a cause, then they go into the government, they're still advocating for the cause. That's one allegation. And then there's the allegation that they were trying to do this sale without congressional approval, even though it would normally be required. But then Flynn gets fired very quickly, within weeks of becoming National Security Advisor. Did this plan continue to be pushed by somebody?
That's the thing about it, that despite efforts from lawyers at the very top levels of the administration, this plan appeared to continue. There were warnings that this should stop, and yet it continued to be pressed on. The plan appeared to be pushed forward with the support of Thomas Barrack. He's the person who chaired Trump's inauguration committee.
Close friend of the president.
Yes, for a very long time. And he has deep ties to the Middle East, including financial ties to Saudi entities. In one memo from Mr. Flynn to President Trump, the National Security Advisor advocated that Mr. Barrack be named a special representative to carry out this nuclear plan.
Wow. Is that all the evidence they have?
Well, the committee wants to find out if there was any part of this plan that's still under consideration. And you'll have to remember that Jared Kushner, he's scheduled to travel next week for a trip to the Middle East that includes a stop in Riyadh, which is the capital of Saudi Arabia. So this is a very pertinent issue that continues to have an effect on the administration's foreign policy.
Really compelling because, of course, Saudi Arabia has been in the news over the war in Yemen and its confrontation with Iran and the U.S. confrontation with Iran and Jamal Khashoggi and so much else. But this nuclear deal has been brewing below the surface the whole time.
Absolutely. And the United States is currently reconsidering and assessing how it should be dealing with the Saudis in the wake of the killing of Jamal Khashoggi.
Amazing story. Tim, thanks so much.
Thanks a lot.
That's NPR's Tim Mack. Why were 5 Americans arrested in Haiti this week?
Yeah, it's a big question right now. Authorities in Port-au-Prince, Haiti's capital, confirmed that 5 U.S. citizens had been detained on Sunday with automatic weapons. Officials are asking who authorized their entry into the country. The arrests come as protesters have clashed with police, demanding that President Jovenel Moïse resign amid rising inflation and also allegations of corruption.
Miami Herald reporter Jacqueline Charles is in Port-au-Prince, and she's on the line. Good morning.
Good morning.
As best you know, who are these 5 Americans?
Well, we can tell that at least 3 of them are former members of the U.S. military. They're veterans. One of them actually had his VA card on him as far as his ID. it's still strange. I mean, because what we've seen is one has a physician assistant's license and one has a firearms license and a detective. The other one runs some sort of an off-road engineering company. So again, are these individuals, are they mercenaries or do they all work for some private security firm? That we still do not know, and the police are still trying to get some answers because they really have not been cooperative.
Okay, so we don't know who hired these people, if anyone did, what they were doing there, or whether they were just doing a little tourist activity there in Haiti. Now, what is the situation with the protests at this point?
Well, let me just go back to the previous question. Members of who are close to the president, they've tried to float this narrative that these guys were here to do some work, some security work for the central bank. But the president of the central bank has debunked that and said he knows nothing about that at all. And even yesterday, the prime minister himself says they were not here for the central bank. But yes, who hired them and why were they here and what are their jobs? We do not know. And hopefully in the next couple of days, we can find out.
Wow. Even deeper questions as some of the more innocent explanations have been offered and shot down. How does this relate, though, to these protests that are taking place in Haiti?
Well, that's what we want to find out. I mean, was this a protection or extraction team for the president himself? He's been under a lot of pressure from protesters, not just the opposition, but even a group of young petrol challengers who've been calling on, not necessarily, they've been basically calling for an account of corruption allegations involving an oil discount fund from Venezuela.
Venezuela gets involved here as well. Wow. Jacqueline Charles, just the beginning of this story, I suspect. Thanks very much for your reporting.
Thanks for having me.
She's a reporter for the Miami Herald. This next story takes us to a high-security lab in Italy.
Yeah, inside that lab, NPR had an exclusive look at a controversial genetic experiment. Genetically modified mosquitoes are being released, and these creatures have been designed to spread a genetic mutation. Entomologist Ruth Mueller says the hope here is that this testing could eventually lead to the eradication of malaria, one of the world's deadliest diseases.
It would be extremely significant because then you would save 450,000 children per year.
NPR health correspondent Rob Stein was the only journalist allowed in the lab when this experiment began. By way of full disclosure, we should note this project is funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which also supports NPR. Rob, good morning.
Good morning, Steve.
So what did you see in that lab?
Yeah, so Steve, these mosquitoes, they're unlike any other kind of genetically engineered organism ever created. They do something that scientists have actually always tried to prevent genetically modified organisms from doing. They can spread a genetic modification incredibly quickly through their own species.
Oh, because they reproduce so very quickly.
Yeah, and they can mate with the natural mosquitoes and spread this mutation. And so scientists built this special lab in Italy specifically to test them. It's in Terni, Italy, which is about an hour north of Rome. And inside this high-security lab is a special climate-controlled chamber. It's designed to recreate the conditions in Africa where malaria is a huge problem. And scientists let me come into the lab at a key moment when they started releasing these modified mosquitoes inside this lab for the first time. So picture this. So you have this special chamber inside this lab. Inside this chamber are huge mosquito cages made out of mosquito netting, and each cage contains hundreds of natural mosquitoes that spread malaria in Africa. And I watched as the scientists very carefully placed dishes of immature modified mosquitoes, dozens of them, inside each of these cages for the first time. And the idea, as you suggested, is that these modified mosquitoes will hopefully mate with the natural mosquitoes and spread their mutation.
And this mutation, how would that save 450,000 children per year?
Yeah, so the idea is that, okay, this is what they did, is they modified these mosquitoes using this new kind of gene editing technique called CRISPR.
Sure, you've reported on a lot.
Yeah, and these mosquitoes carry something called a gene drive. And the gene drive is what makes them spread their mutation so fast. And what this mutation does is it turns all the female mosquitoes into kind of mutants. They're kind of half female, half male, so they can't bite. Their mouths are like male mosquitoes, and that means they can't spread malaria. And they're also sterile, so they can't lay eggs. So the idea is that, if you release them in Africa, they can sterilize the local population of mosquitoes and spread this mutation and hopefully, help eradicate malaria.
Okay, that sounds amazing. Malaria is such a killer. But when you talk about sending a gene modification out into the wild and you don't know what exactly is going to happen out there, are some people terrified?
Yeah. This is raising really some big concerns. I mean, the critics say, hold on a minute. I mean, these gene organisms like this, they are just way too dangerous. I mean, who knows what might happen if anyone ever tried to release something like this in the wild? It could, mess up the environment in all sorts of ways, knock out a key species in the food chain, allow more dangerous mosquitoes to come in with other diseases. Here's Dana Pearl. She's with the environmental group Friends of the Earth.
This is an experimental technology which could have devastating impacts. We can't be taking lightly this extermination technology. We need to slow down.
Well, are the scientists heeding that warning to slow down?
Yeah, so they say, look, we understand that this technology is really new and it raises all kinds of fears, and that's why we're being so careful about testing them in a special lab to make sure none of them escape, and even if they did escape, they're in Italy where these mosquitoes couldn't survive. So we're going to take this very slowly, very stepwise, test them to see if they're working, and make sure that they don't have any negative effects in the environment before anyone considers releasing them into the wild.
Hopefully they had really good screens on the windows in that lab. Rob, thanks so much.
Oh, sure, Steve. Thanks for having me.
That's NPR's Rob Stein.
We begin with the story of a 24-year-old woman who fled America to join ISIS. She is pleading with the U.S. government to allow her to return home.
Her name is Hoda Muthana, and she was a student at the University of Alabama when she decided in 2014 to just leave her life behind and travel to Syria to join the Islamic State. She eventually fled the caliphate and is now living in a Kurdish refugee camp. Her family's lawyer spoke to NPR this week.
She is disgusted by the person she was. She deeply, deeply regrets it.
But the Trump administration says she is not a citizen and will not be allowed to come back to the United States.
So what's going to happen next here? Let's turn to NPR's Ruth Sherlock, who has been following this story from Beirut. Good morning, Ruth.
Good morning.
So how did Hoda Muthana end up in Syria in the first place? And what happened to her? What was she doing during her time with ISIS?
Well, so she was a student in Alabama, as far as we know, but then she duped her parents into thinking that she was going on a college trip. But then, every parent's nightmare, bought a plane ticket with the tuition money to Turkey, and from there she crossed into Syria to join ISIS. It does seem that for a while she was convinced about ISIS's mission. The New York Times reports that she used a pseudonym to post messages on Twitter that actually called for attacks on Americans. But then she says she saw a lot of the violence of ISIS firsthand. Here she is talking to ABC News.
We would see dead bodies in public. We would see kids seeing dead bodies in public. We would see limbs splattered on the floor.
She also says that all this made her wake up and change. She says she regrets going. She has a child now, and she wants to return to the U.S.
Well, and return to the United States, not like to be free. I mean, her lawyer says she wants to repay her debt to society. She's ready to serve time in prison if she has to. So talk about what the Trump administration is arguing here in terms of refusing to let her back here.
So they're saying that she isn't a U.S. citizen. They say that she has no legal basis to be in the U.S., no valid passport or right to a passport, nor a travel visa. And President Trump tweeted his support for Secretary of State Mike Pompeo's decision. Muthana's lawyer, however, says that he has evidence that she is an American citizen. He says he's got a birth certificate showing she was born in the U.S. and that she did have a valid passport that she used to travel to Syria. One possible reason is that the State Department may be saying that her father was a Yemeni diplomat, so the family would have been under Yemeni jurisdiction. Except the lawyer says the father gave up the diplomat's job before she was born. So it all remains to be seen, really.
A lot of technicalities maybe to work through. Isn't this exactly what the Trump administration has been urging European countries to do, though, to bring home people who joined ISIS?
Yeah, he's urged all countries to take back their citizens. I mean, here, I guess the technicality again is that the administration is arguing that she isn't a citizen.
And, I mean, there are hundreds of ISIS fighters as well as women and children who are being detained by coalition forces still today. I mean, are a lot of them in the same kind of legal limbo as this woman?
Yeah, we believe that there's at least 1,800 foreign women and children in these camps, from 46 countries. And many of them, especially from Europe, are in this legal limbo, with many countries saying, we don't want these people back.
All right, NPR's Ruth Sherlock. Thanks a lot, Ruth.
Thank you.
The allegations against a Coast Guard lieutenant who's been arrested by the FBI in Washington, D.C., I mean, they are chilling.
Right. So according to court documents, the suspect is a self-described white nationalist, and he stockpiled weapons and wrote that he wanted to kill as many people as possible. He allegedly had this list of potential targets that included Democratic political leaders like Nancy Pelosi, as well as political activists and organizations and media personalities, news anchors.
And we have NPR national security correspondent Greg Myrie here to talk to us about this. Greg, who is this suspect?
He is Coast Guard Lieutenant Christopher Paul Hasson, and he worked at the Coast Guard headquarters here in Washington for the past 3 years. Was an office guy, was a scheduler mostly. Now, he, in some of his writings, he talks about being a skinhead for the past 30 years, and he had a long military career. He served in the Marines and the Army National Guard previously, dating back to the 80s and 90s, written a lot about being a white nationalist, expressed neo-Nazi views, and the prosecutors are calling a domestic terrorist. In the very first line of the court filing about him, they write, "The defendant intends to murder innocent civilians on a scale rarely seen in this country."
Wow, I mean, that's just terrifying based on what it sounds like he was planning. So what led authorities to uncover his plot?
It seems the Coast Guard started investigating. We're not exactly clear what set them off, but they began this. And then the FBI came in and arrested Hasson in the Coast Guard parking lot last Friday. They went then to his basement apartment in Silver Spring, Maryland. They found 15 firearms, pistols, rifles, semi-automatic weapons, more than 1,000 rounds of ammo. He also had steroids. He apparently thought this would help him, make him stronger for an attack. He'd apparently been amassing these weapons for about the past 2 years or so.
And so how much detail are the authorities getting in terms of who he might have been targeting and what exactly he was planning to do here?
So apparently stuff he had been writing on his computer gave quite a bit of detail. It seems he was drafting letters or emails, and it was not clear that he was sending them anywhere beyond to himself. But he talked about the liberal globalist ideology destroying the world, and especially white people. And he has this spreadsheet that's been released by the authorities, and it has the names, often just one name, but it seems pretty clear who he's talking about. Democratic leaders like Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, Senator Tim Kaine, Senator Cory Booker, Kamala Harris, and others. And then cable TV news hosts from CNN and MSNBC, Don Lemon, Chris Cuomo, Chris Hayes, Ari Melber. The common thread seems to be that they were all very, very critical of President Trump.
I mean, this has got to shock other people who work at the Coast Guard. You've been talking to some of them?
I did. I was able to get in touch with one of his coworkers, a guy named Adam Stolzberg, who'd been working there with him for about the past 6 months. Now, he said he seemed pretty normal, calm, nothing really strange or outlandish. He said he had a lot of tattoos. He drove a Harley Davidson to work. They knew he had been arrested last Friday, but they were sort of talking among themselves, not quite sure what the charges were. And then it was a real bombshell, they said, when they heard about it through the news media reports that started breaking yesterday.
All right, and he's going to be appearing in court in Maryland today, is that right?
That's right. First appearance, and the prosecutors want to keep him held without bail.
NPR's Greg Myrie. Greg, thanks.
Thanks, David.
All right, the investigation into the alleged attack on the actor Jussie Smollett has taken yet another crazy turn.
I still want to believe, with everything that has happened, that there's something called justice.
That was the Empire star talking on Good Morning America last week. He was addressing doubts about his claim that two men in masks attacked him and used homophobic and racist slurs. Yesterday, though, Smollett went from victim to suspect. He was charged with felony disorderly conduct for allegedly filing a false police report. Chicago police are negotiating what they call a reasonable surrender for Smollett's arrest, and there's a bond hearing today.
All right, Miles Bryan is a reporter with NPR member station WBEZ in Chicago and has been covering this. Hi, Miles.
Hey.
So do we know what evidence or what information police got that led them to file this charge against Jussie Smollett?
You know, just to be careful, we don't know exactly what information they've received recently that led them to this charge. I think we can expect prosecutors to lay out their case at bond court this afternoon. But we do know that two brothers who last week were arrested and questioned in the case and were considered suspects testified for a couple hours in front of a grand jury yesterday, and that was the immediate precursor to these charges coming down. So that's the latest we have from that.
Okay, so the two guys who were accused, I mean, they spent time with investigators, and whatever they said may have led to them saying that what Jussie Smollett filed in terms of police report just wasn't true. What is Jussie Smollett's legal team saying now? I mean, they sort of addressed this question being out there as to whether he might have made this up earlier. Now that this charge has been filed, what are they saying?
You know, I reached his legal team late last night. I got a statement from them, and they are standing strong. It seems they said that they plan to mount a vigorous defense. They also said they plan to run their own investigation of the case, and they specifically pointed out they criticized leaks in the case. That there's been lots of unconfirmed reporting from anonymous sources within the Chicago Police Department, among others, that has sort of driven the momentum of this story. But they seem to be standing defiant in their position.
And just describe to me exactly what the charge is. This is a felony. It's a felony to file a false police report, a felony charge?
Yeah, so it's a felony disorderly conduct charge. So it's a little strange, but it is essentially making this allegedly filing a false police report, a felony. And, that carries 1 to 3 years in prison, potentially, although it could be probationable and various fines. So it's a serious charge.
This is just a crazy story, in part because we're dealing with, I mean, a really popular television star on a popular program. What's it been like covering this case?
It is just wild. Every couple of hours it changes, and it's been difficult for us to be careful about separating what we know and what's just speculation. So just trying to be careful with the facts here.
All right, that is Miles Bryan, who is a reporter for NPR member station WBEZ in Chicago, talking to us about the latest turn in the case of Jussie Smollett, who has now been charged with a felony for allegedly filing a false police report. Miles, thanks for following all this.
Thank you.